here. Okay. So yeah, I guess I'll get started. So this is a talk, kind of a overview of my career in the game industry, as well as level design in the industry in general, and it's sort of a stream of consciousness, kind of assemblage of things. So yeah, we'll get started. Let me see. Yeah. So yeah, who I am, why are you here listening to me talk, right? My name is Rich Wilson. I'm the level design lead at Arkane Studios here in Austin. We have a French branch as well, and I've worked on previous titles like Darksiders and Ghostbusters here in Austin, as well as on BioShock 2, Dishonored, and most recently, that has been announced at least, I've worked on the Prey game series, Prey and the Moon Crash follow-up. Yeah. So what do I do, right? So I said, I'm the lead level designer at Arkane. So that comes with a set of responsibilities that's sort of a combination of management as well as design sensibility. Hold on a second. Okay. So I've got some sort of images here, and I guess I can't point to them with my hands. So that means several things, right? For one, putting out a lot of fires. So if there is some sort of design emergency or we're in wrap up mode and something needs to be solved or fixed, I can come in and solve those problems because I know the domain space and can speak to whatever design needs need to be filled there. I sort of keep the big picture of the whole project in my head at all times. So if anyone has any questions about the campaign or any level in the game, they can come to me first. And if I don't know it, then I know who does know it. But ideally, I have the entire campaign space just to draw from immediately, basically. The sort of I don't know if my cursor is showing up here or not, but the sort of warden looking out for not really the discipline of the team, but keeping everyone moving forward and addressing any problems that come up on the team and making sure everyone's doing their job and things like that. It's the less glamorous part of being a lead, but that's the managerial aspect, right? Of making sure people are showing up to work, and most of the time that's not a problem, thankfully. The sort of cartographer roadmap kind of image down here in the bottom left. That's seeing where the project is going and making sure everyone is heading there together. Keeping the vision and making sure the team knows the vision. So not only keeping that whole picture in my head, but making sure everyone else knows what their piece is in that puzzle. And then lastly, another managerial aspect is the sort of group counselor kind of role, where I make sure everyone's getting their needs met, being heard on the team. They feel like they're contributing, any kind of interpersonal problems between people, working that sort of stuff out. So that's the less design and more management end of things. And I'm clicking on the wrong. There we go. So level designers have a lot of different duties. If you look at level design between studios, you'll see vastly different roles and what different people or different studios deem level designer. It varies from studio to studio, right? So you've got the sort of like engineer of experiences, the upper left there, someone who's putting together these clockwork sort of scripting scenarios to make things happen. You've got people with sort of cinematographer or directorial sort of eye for storytelling in a visual and interactive manner. The dungeon master is kind of the obvious, you're setting up encounters for people to stumble upon, traps and treasure and things like that. The Loki image there is like you're the subverter of expectations, tricking people or making them learn something about themselves in the process. Easter Bunny, you're hiding loot and breadcrumbs for players to come across and find. And yes, I found the most creepy, unsettling Easter Bunny that I could possibly manage. And then there's the narrative design aspect as well. You're writing stories and telling stories about characters and places and things like that, right? That you want to strike an emotional chord with players. What level design isn't? I guess I forgot an image or two here, but level design is not architecture, is not environment art. A lot of the times you'll see these videos, and not necessarily knocking this particular video or this person, but you'll see these videos where it's like making a level in 1 hour, and then they show the speed assembly of a level. But level design is an iterative process where you're playing through the space and you're having other people play through the space to experience the level. It's not just cramming something together that looks really cool in a screenshot. It's actually playing through that space and figuring out what works and what doesn't work and stuff. So you can't really put together a level this good looking in an hour that also plays well, right? Also, level design is not sitting in a director's chair and telling people how to put your vision together or something like that, right? There's a lot of hard work that goes into it, and you're not just the idea person. It's very much hands-on. Where I work specifically, and I know this is mirrored in a lot of different studios, you have the combination of environment art and level design. We have a role specifically called the architect that is very involved directly with the layout of the space and everything. So you get this relationship between art and level design, where you're either partners in crime, or you're kind of shackled together and working on this same thing, and trying to see this through to the end. And sometimes it's like any tight interpersonal relationship, like a marriage almost, where you're both trying to accomplish the same goal, but you maybe have different visions for that goal, and so you have to kind of work that stuff out. So it can be really rewarding, but also can be contentious at times. So when we're building levels, we've got a few different phases of the level's development, the cycle basically that it goes through. And I'm kind of blitzing through this, and we'll answer questions at the end, but I want to make sure I get through all of the high level points and the major beats. Have time for questions. So the concept phase is the initial sort of blue sky. What is our game, and what kind of levels do we need in our game, and what role is this level going to serve in that bigger picture? So this is the sky's the limit. Come up with whatever you want here, as long as it fits within the sort of scale of the game. From there, you transition to a paper map phase, where the art team will go off, and or your artist or whatever will go off and start coming up with reference images and things like that. Reference is very important to sort of get an authenticity to a space, right? So they'll be gathering reference for the type of spaces that you're working on, and the level designer will work on a paper map generally. All of this stuff has a caveat of like a lot of studios do things differently from one another, right? So my experience over, I guess, a handful of different studios has been this, but your mileage may vary, right? But anyway, the level designer works on the paper map, and that's so that they can get a rough idea in a cheap fashion of how a level is put together. The more you can work in a cheap phase, the quicker you can iterate, and the less difficulty you'll have in changing things, if they don't work. And paper maps, vary in their polish. This is probably an overly polished paper map because it's not as quick and fluid to change. But yeah.
Now, if I may just quickly interrupt.
Sure.
So this seems like this happens either during pre-production or like at the beginning of development. And do you already know what mechanics will exist in the game for the player, like how they will move, what items they can use, or does that kind of change throughout development and you change your level design, or how does that process kind of work?
So it's the latter. Ideally, as much as you possibly can at that phase at the beginning, but there will be things that get introduced or metrics that get changed, like on Dishonored, for instance. Midway through development of the game, or maybe in the latter phases, we decided that blink was going to be an ability that player had from the very beginning, for free. They were just going to always have that. And then different metrics scaled up, like, now they can jump higher, now they can't, or now we came up with a really cool new power that we're going to add, and levels need to accommodate that. So you have to be pretty flexible. And so when you're building this stuff out, keeping that kind of stuff in mind as much as possible. Yeah. Also, levels. So levels will go through this arc in sort of overlapping phases. So you won't, depending on the team size and everything, you won't have everyone starting at paper map with every level at one time. You'll usually go through a level, and then that level designer will move on to another level, and they'll sort of overlap each other. So by the time you're on some of the further in levels, you'll have a more clear picture of the metrics and the powers the player has. And then you'll go back to those other levels that are already more, developed and change them, basically.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the gray box phase is next, and this is where you're moving into 3D from the 2D. And again, you're trying to keep it as fluid as possible because you want to be able to make changes like that, right? So it's like, oh, this bridge is too long. We need to move this entire half of the level closer to that other half. So it should be easy to take everything, move it, play it, move it, play it, in this sort of cycle, right? And meanwhile, the art team will be either working hand in hand with the gray box effort, or they'll be working on what we call a pretty corner, sort of like this in the bottom left, where they take a bunch of assets and they're trying to cobble together and put together what the look of the level will be like. It won't necessarily be good for gameplay, but it's them doing their sort of first pass on figuring out the visuals. And this the gray boxing phase, depending on the tools you work in, there are a lot of different ways to do this. I know like Unreal has BSP. Pro Builder is Unity's sort of answer to that. After this comes the production phase, and this is the main sort of engine of development. This is when the art team and the design team integrate all their stuff, and ideally both sides look look similar, and the integration process is pretty seamless. But sometimes there can be bumps, and where the art team has this idea and the design team needs to collaborate and compromise and stuff like that. But during this phase, you've got the art collaboration, you've got a bunch of level reviews. So there's an iterative process where you build stuff, and then you have a review where everyone looks at it, and then they make critiques and commentary and things like that. Ideally, you're getting people I guess the next point there, tissue testing. You're getting people to play through the level. Tissue testing means you find someone that has never played the level before. They play it once, and then they're as useful as a tissue. You toss them basically because they've been sort of tainted, right? They know the level at least at some degree. You can have people that come back and test for other purposes and stuff, but tissue testing is valuable because you get a fresh perspective. From those reviews, you get prioritized task lists from your production team. So they'll give you, this is all the stuff that came out of the meeting. These are high level, mid level, low level. The priority is important because you need to be able to prioritize basically and keep the low level stuff at the bottom. And if you get extra time, then you can work on that. But it's crucial that the mission be completable. And then way down here, you can have your side quest about someone growing a special fruit or something like that. Bug fixing kind of goes without saying, but maintaining playability, making sure that people can go from end to end without crashing or coming across an impassable collision wall or something like that. And then sometimes you get complete overhaul of a level, or levels get cut, direction changes. Sometimes things happen. It's something that you just kind of have to brace yourself for. A word on tools really quick. There are some industry standards like Unreal or Unity and things like that, but you never really know what you're going to end up working with in the industry. So it's good to have solid design skills first, and then tool skills second, and be able to learn new tools as you go, because you never know what kind of proprietary engine you might be working on, or side tools that they're using alongside that. Gating. So level design is primarily keeping people out of places in creative and interesting ways. That's because otherwise they'll just move. I guess like this football analogy here, they'll just go from one end of the level to the other, and it'll take like 30 seconds. Look at some speed runs, and you'll see exactly what no gating means. So level design is coming up with a bunch of different interesting locks and keys that take various forms. So finally is the wrapping up phase. And again, most of the time, you're not going to wrap up every level at the same time. This is going to happen in overlapping cycles. But wrapping up a level means, cutting what isn't working, what isn't, what you don't have time for, and then sending the level on its way. It's a really important period, and it's important to know when to stop adding stuff and when to start polishing what you have and adding no more stuff. It takes a lot of discipline, because the more stuff you add up to the very end, the more mediocre stuff you've got in your level. But if you can stop and polish what's there, then you'll have a bunch of really, really good stuff. One thing that's hard for new developers to, I think, imagine is that the player does not know what you've cut from your game. So you may have this really cool idea that's just not going to make it, but the players won't know that that wasn't in there. I had this amazing idea for an aircraft carrier that crashes into the city and all these things, but if you weren't able to make that, the players won't know, unless there's an art book or something that tells all. So there are some high-level considerations you need to keep in mind, and this is primarily from my level design perspective, but this also applies to all sorts of content creation roles. But yeah, so metrics, looking at metrics. Are your interactions in your level consistent with every other level in the game? That's important, because consistency, I think I'll talk about this as well when I get to my sort of design ethos later, but consistency is important, basically. Tone, this is another kind of consistency. Do your Monty Python jokes that you've kind of Easter egged in there, do those fit in with the theme of the game, or do they actually need to be cut and and toned down? Do elements repeat too much or too little over multiple levels? So looking at patterns of mechanical use. So maybe you've got a really cool jetpack sequence in your level, but the level before and after also have really involved jetpack sequences. So now you have to look at the big picture and say, well, okay, we need to cut this jetpack thing because 2 other levels adjacent are doing it, that sort of thing. And then looking at escalation, do the challenges scale with the player skill? So if your level is at the end of the game versus a tutorial at the beginning of the game, does that map to the overall arc of the game? So my career path, how I got here, it was a few years ago, so it might not be directly applicable because there are like game development programs now. But yeah, we'll talk about that. So in the beginning, I was just a kid that really liked video games. I played Donkey Kong Jr. a lot at my grandmother's store, and so I made a whole bunch of levels for that in notebook paper, and played Nintendo and all that stuff. This is back in the 80s, and that enthusiasm led me to do things like program basic programs out of magazines, and QBasic with the game Gorillas that came with it, modifying that and seeing what happened. There were some early level design tools that came with games like this game called Jetpack. You could do this simple tile-based level editing, but it was addictive, and I got sucked into that. Or building levels for Doom, and there was a local BBS. You could dial in over a modem and download levels and share levels and compare them and stuff like that. So I got into that at an early age, and that kind of lodged itself in my brain, and it became a sort of inevitability that I would get into game development, however naive that was. That was my trajectory. That was the path. I got into college. We didn't have any, I just went to a state college, University of Southern Mississippi. There weren't any game development programs there, but there was computer science. And then there was like this virtual reality program in the architecture department that I took part in. And that was just basically building Half-Life maps. So I stuck around there for a while. I got into they had a high performance visualization center where I got to do some VR programming with, this isn't the exact setup that we had, but it was similar. They called them caves. They were like giant rear projected screens with shutter glasses that you would use for VR. So we did that kind of stuff, and I got a lot of experience doing a little bit of everything, and kind of stuck around there through grad school and stuff. I came up with a bunch of portfolio ideas, and I put together this really rough portfolio on a CD in a little tin and mailed it out to 73 different companies, and got nothing back. I eventually applied at a place called High Voltage Studio that had an entry-level design opening, and they had a test, and I took the test, and I got the job. And that was kind of the beginning, right? That was the foot on the bottom rung of the ladder. I had a very scattered portfolio, and I think that was part of the reason why I didn't get any hits back from anyone. I'll talk about this later on as well when I get into the advice section. But yeah, my focus application was much better received, and I got my foot in the door, you know, as an entry level designer. I look at this as kind of a ladder, right? Getting your foot in the door, period, is the first step. Do whatever you can to do that, and then go from there, right? I've kind of viewed it as like refining my trajectory as I go. You know, first was like, I'm in video games, hooray! That's the first step, and then you know, then I got to go to a studio that wasn't doing licensed games and was doing original IP. And I was like, I can work, you know, on original IP now. That's really great. And then working closer with genres that I enjoy more, or you know, finding a good studio. I think finding a good studio is as important as, or more important than, working on cool projects, because the people you work with can make your day-to-day life much more enjoyable. And you know, you can work on a good project with not great people and still be miserable, basically. But then, yeah, working on a specific franchise you enjoy, getting senior status at a studio, becoming a lead, and so forth and so on. But all the while, you're gaining experience regardless of what you're doing, and whether those are, well, I'm never doing that again, or you know, this is the best way to do this that I've seen so far because I've been at 2 or 3 different places now. Accumulating that sort of knowledge is important regardless of where you're at. My personal design philosophy, having been through several different studios and working on, you know, several different projects. First, there's a simulation spectrum. I think there's a lot of sort of like the console wars or whatever. There are people that are like, well, that's not a video game. You're not working on a video game. That's just a, you know, walking simulator or whatever. But I think you know, part of my philosophy is I think there's a spectrum to the density of interaction in different game titles. And I think there's room for everybody, right? Over here on the far left, I don't know if I'm mirroring what's above me or not, but far left, you've got things like, you know, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, or some of those, you know, story scenes in Uncharted 4, things like that. Somewhere in the middle of the road, you've got the Call of Duty games where, yeah, they're video games, but there's not a lot of environmental simulation. And then in the far right, you've got things like Minecraft where every single square meter is interactive and simulated, or Teardown that came out recently, the immersive sims and things like that, right? I personally prefer working on games to the right end of the spectrum, but I can acknowledge that there is craft and value in the ones on the far left end of the spectrum. Saying yes to the player, this is a big immersive sim. So the genre I primarily work in these days is immersive sim, which is a hybrid of first-person shooter RPG with a lot of simulational elements in the environment. And so a lot of the things we do is in service of saying yes to the player. And that basically means that the player looks at something and formulates a plan in their head and says, I think I can interact with this in this way. We try our darndest to facilitate that. You know, quick example here. Let me see how we're doing on time, actually, just in case. Okay, yeah, we're good. Quick example here. There was a poisoning scene that I scripted in Dishonored, and one character can poison another character. You can go interact with the glasses to switch the poison and stuff like that. But it came up that the player could break the glasses. These 2 glasses they're holding. You come into the room before the thing even happens, and so we had an option. We had a sort of path, you know, choice. Either support the simulation, because everywhere else you see these glasses in the game, the player can pick them up and throw them and break them or smash them or whatever. So what do? And I leaned on the side of saying yes to the player and saying, okay, well, the player can break these glasses. So now what? You know, we're not going to make them special plot glasses and make them static. We could, and that would save a lot of time and trouble. But we supported it, and then so I ended up making this entire other branch of this assassination scene where, you know, this guy would lure the guy down into the basement and stab him in the back instead if these glasses happen to be broken, and so forth. So yeah. And the players that ended up experiencing that, you know, it was very rewarding to them because their path was, you know, supported. Basically, they had their expectations paid off in a novel way. Consistency and clarity. Regardless of what your interactive rules are, make sure they are consistent. So you can see here, like explosive canisters. If there are any kind of pressurized canisters that explode in your game, every instance of that sort of thing across the board should be explosive. Like, you know, even if you've got some silver ones and they're supposed to be, that's supposed to be, you know, maybe not oxygen. Oxygen is explosive. Something non-explosive, right? If it looks like the other explosive canisters, then it should be either removed from the game or converted into an explosive canister. Clarity, on the other hand, well, clarity kind of goes hand in hand with that consistency. But things like metrics buffering, so the player can read the room at a glance and be able to form a plan. So you know, you can see this metrics buffering here from Uncharted, making sure that all of your cover is very clearly within the range that it serves, half height, full height, etc. And there's nothing a little bit too short to be half height cover, so when you crouch behind it, you get shot in the head. Or something that's a little bit higher than jump height, so you go up to it to try to clamber up to escape enemies, and you can't make the jump because it's 2 inches too high, right? So make sure there's clarity in the interaction space. What, not how. I prefer telling the player what they need to do. So if it's like obtain a hard drive with information on it, or you know, assassinate a character or something like that, tell them what they need to do, but not how to do it. Leave all those steps up to the player. There's an example here of our demo for Prey, where people learned that they could use this dart launching foam dart gun to bounce darts off of the back of something through a window to hit a door release button from behind and open the door to get in. And that was great. Like, the only thing we cared about as developers was that they obtained whatever was inside the room and not how they got in there. You know, there was a key card to open the door or something, and that was one route they could take, but they also found this other way to get in, and that was great. Career advice. All right, so yeah, based off of my sort of path into the industry and what I've seen in my time here, as well as you know, since I'm a lead, I am also in charge of hiring people now. So this is pretty relevant still to this day. Useful skills for a designer to have, and again, a lot of this stuff applies across the board. Cross-discipline exposure. Know how to communicate across departments. That means learning a little bit, because level design especially, and every department kind of has their own version of this, but level design interacts with almost every department in the studio. You're going to work with engineers, animators, environment artists, systems designers, sound people, all that sort of stuff, right? So know how to communicate across those departments. Know a little bit about all of those disciplines. Don't become like an expert in everything, because that's impossible. But yeah, just know how to talk to them, so you can kind of speak their language when they are talking to you about problems, or you're trying to solve things together. Communicating, know how to sell your dreams to others, not like a used car salesman, but know how to be able to articulate your ideas, because as the level designer, you're going to have to work with other people to help them bring your ideas to life, right? If you're like, yeah, I've got this really cool idea for a level that's in an insane asylum. So you're going to, you know, you're probably working with a lead to make that kind of level. But let's say you've got like, I've got a really cool idea for a 0G sequence where the player flips this thing and the entire room goes into 0G. You're going to have to work with an engineer and your lead and people like that to get that implemented, right? So you need to be able to sell that idea in a clear and concise way to other people so that they get excited about it as well. Time management and multitasking. Know how to finish what you start. It's really easy to have big, grand ideas. It's much harder to actually see those through from start to finish and know when to cut sections of your idea out because they aren't going to fit. Staying current. Know the trends in your trade, what works, what doesn't, and why. So play video games. And ideally play video games that your studio makes, or the same kinds of games, right? So you can be like, well, yeah, I was playing a game over the weekend and I saw this idea and I think we could implement that in a better way in our game and it would help our game out, or something like that. Or this is what we shouldn't do, that sort of thing. Product focus. This, I kind of alluded to this earlier. Know how to pick your battles and tame your ego. A lot of the times, especially if you're new, I had this problem myself. It can be easy to dig in your heels and be like, no, this design is sacred. I cannot budge. Knowing when to give in, knowing when your idea doesn't necessarily fit in with the big picture of the whole game, and also being cognizant of the phase of the project that you're in. It's much easier to come up with new ideas and things like that in the beginning of the project. But near the end of the project, you have to learn how to deal with what you already have more than coming up with new stuff and solving problems with the things you already have in your toolbox rather than coming up with whole new scenarios and tools and things. Problem solving and downstream impact. So knowing how to make ideas work within constraints. Again, it's much harder to come up with solutions with a limited set of tools than it is just to blue sky something that might take years and years to develop. But also knowing what your idea means for other departments. So if you're like, okay, we're going to solve this problem by having a character come in and talk to the player and hand them a map. But then you have to know, okay, that means we're going to have VO for that character. We're going to have the animators deal with, animating that scene if I'm handing the map over and syncing a map into or character hands, and someone will have to make the map and, et cetera. And what if the player shoots that character? So now we need a whole systems solution for friendly characters getting shot and so forth, right? So just knowing what it means in the long run for your idea. And then the last, enthusiasm. Knowing how to stay positive without artifice. It's easy to be positive in the very beginning of your career, because this is an amazing sort of dream job for people, right? It can be harder in the middle of a project and near the end of a project when nothing new is happening and you're just kind of like seeing this through to the end. Like you already know all the cool things that are going to happen, and there's no novelty anymore. You're just trying to push this rock up a hill. So knowing how to stay positive and without artifice, you don't want to like put on a happy face and try to cheerlead artificially for people. And it's tricky, and it helps to remind yourself that like the worst thing that happened to me at my job today was I got into an argument about orc hit points. That was. And meanwhile, there are people with with real jobs out there like saving lives and risking their safety on construction sites or stuff like that, right? So it's definitely a dream job. Disclaimer on some of the stuff I'm going to say here. Different companies do different things differently. Yeah. So when you're looking for a job, and this is almost taken straight from my level design class. So study job openings. Look at even as early as you possibly can. Look at job openings in the fields that you're interested in. Look at the skills that are required, and look at the would be nice skills as well, and see how those apply to you, right? Do I have these skills? Am I on the track to have these skills? Maybe I should pick up some new skills. Study companies whose games you play. Oh, sorry, I'm going ahead of myself. Study the job openings. So you look at actual openings on actual websites. Next up, the skills. So yeah, look at the skills that are required and the would-be nice ones as well, and honestly assess yourself and say, well, okay, I don't know 3D Studio or a modeling package, so maybe I should pick that up. Study companies whose games you play. So if you really dig, League of Legends or World of Warcraft or something, go to that company's website and just browse their career openings and see, okay, well, there's a level design opening here at Riot. What does that look like? What do they require? What are they looking for experience levels and skills and things like that? Check out salary surveys. So the IGDA has an annual salary survey that they do, and just see. And again, this is this can be as early as you possibly can, but see like, okay, I want to be an AI programmer. I want to be a level designer. I want to be an audio engineer, and just look at what you can expect for a salary. Just so there are no surprises, right? I mean, this is kind of a dream job sort of thing. So if you're getting in because you really love doing this stuff, but it doesn't hurt to get paid as well, right? And that salary survey also can go hand in hand with looking at what cities you want to live in, and where you want to spend your life, or portions thereof. Speaking of that, there are only really a handful of major hubs of game development in the United States. there are several overseas, Canada, et cetera, if you're interested in that. But you've basically got Seattle, San Francisco, LA, and Austin. Dallas is okay. There are some other cities that have a handful of studios, but the bigger ones are those 4 really. But yeah, go to Game Dev Map and look and see what studios are where. And if you can imagine living there and so forth, you're probably going to want to or need to relocate for your first handful of jobs until you get more experience and can leverage things more, basically. Focus. So focus on the role you want. Again, when I did that portfolio thing a long time ago, my portfolio was like, okay, here are some mediocre textures I put together. Here's some really mediocre walk cycles. Here's some programming I did, and it was just a mishmash of stuff that was all sort of average, and it wasn't focused, right? So a game development studio is going to be like, okay, what can you do for us? What is your role that you want? I just want any job you've got is not going to cut it. It's not going to, no one is going to seek out the person that's like, I don't know, what do you want me to do? They want someone that's like, no, I am focused on doing texture art and I'm good at it because I've been practicing just that, and that is my focus. That's what I can do for you, right? In exchange for a paycheck. And looking at job postings will help you narrow this down. Again, if you go to, Bungie or Blizzard or whoever, look at their job openings and you're like, hey, that looks like a cool job. What's involved there? Oh yeah, I like doing all those things. That's what I want to do. Then that'll help you focus. The cover letter, they vary in effectiveness. A lot of the times I don't even see a cover letter when people are applying, because those get kind of pruned off or sheared off at the human resources level. And I just get like, here's the portfolio and the resume, and that's it. Don't be too formal, but don't be too casual. That's kind of easy to say, but harder to do. Tailor it to the studio you're applying for. Explain why you like their games and want to work for them. Don't just do a form letter and copy and paste the name of the studio, because people can feel that. And you're like, I'm interested in game development job. Like say, I like your games because I played this game a lot, and these are the things I like about it, and so forth. But don't make them too long, a few paragraphs tops, because people don't have time to read through a whole lot of really long cover letters. Similarly, your resume, especially if you're just out of the gate, keep it focused and short, 1 page if you don't have any experience in the industry. Focus on formatting, spelling, and presentation. Again, this is your sort of like, first impression, right? Someone looks at the resume, and if you've got the job you want misspelled or some grammar problems or something, that's going to be off-putting immediately. List your skills and relevant experience. Don't be afraid to do interesting things with the formatting, but don't go too far overboard. Don't make it too video gamey. Don't make it like, this is a Dungeons and Dragons character sheet. Make it, focus on clarity over interesting. Tailor your approach to the company you're looking at. So if you're looking at a quest-centric level design position, include writing samples. If there's a multiplayer studio that you're wanting to work at, then look at doing some multiplayer maps for games. I'm trying to think of mapping and modding friendly games these days, but all I can think of is Counter-Strike or something. So, but anyway, coming up with actual samples that apply to that studio and the role you're looking for. And yeah, also in the process, it'll help you figure out whether you'd be a good fit for that place or for that job. If you're like, oh yeah, quest design, they want me to write some dialogue samples. I'm writing dialogue samples and I hate writing these dialogue samples. Maybe quest design isn't for me. Portfolio is probably the most crucial thing that you can put together when applying for a content creation job. And for level design, you want to include things like paper maps. And I'm kind of zipping through this, so I'll make sure we have time for questions. I've got extra time after this, but I don't know how long the meeting will run. Screenshots of your work, design documentation to show your sort of train of thought, and the most important thing I think are level walkthroughs. So you can actually show your level in motion, because you can plan all you want with screenshots and design docs and things like that, but for level design especially, I can't tell if you're good at level design if I don't see the thing in motion and see how a player would actually move through the space and things you've accounted for. Like, oh yeah, what if the player goes left here instead of right? What if they find the door before they find the key, or the key before they find the door, etc. So that kind of thing is important. Don't be afraid to cull your portfolio. Less is more in this case, definitely. You don't want to have a whole bunch of mediocre stuff and a few nuggets of good things buried in there, because by the time the person gets through all the mediocre stuff, they're going to be fatigued and might miss the good stuff. Accessibility, make sure that your portfolio is very easy to access. If you're doing level design stuff, make sure that they can just download an executable and play it, or play it in a browser, or watch a YouTube video of it being played. Most people do not have time to download. Oh yeah, if you download this mod for Thief 3 and install this other package, then download the level. No one's gonna have time to do that. And that brings us to questions. Let me take another slug of water here.
So I guess before we go into audience questions, I actually had one question, sort of a specific one about some level design concepts.
Sure.
So on the topic of level readability, can you talk a bit about the visual aspect of making sure that a player doesn't get the wrong idea about what they can and can't do? Like, for instance, a pile of boxes that look like they should be broken or that you could jump over, but is actually just like a piece of set dressing that acts as a wall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Okay, wait, sorry, I was unsharing my, am I on camera still?
Yep.
Okay,
gotcha.
Cool. Okay, so the question was, can you repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. Basically, can you talk about sort of the visual aspect of making sure that players don't go where they're not supposed to, or don't think that they can go somewhere where there's just like a wall they can't pass?
Yeah, that is sort of the ongoing struggle of my entire job, basically. You have to have a tight communication loop with your art team, and everyone has to be on board with the kind of game you're making. That kind of thing is a lot easier for, like, oh yeah, it's a point and click game, it's Diablo or whatever, so we can just make a rough pile of crates or something, and you can't click past it, so you can't go past it. But for first-person games, for games with mobility abilities and things like that, you have to make sure everything is very crystal clear, that it cannot be. There's like one thing I can't talk about current project, but if you look at like games like Far Cry, for instance, anytime there is an interior that's accessible in a building, you can see through the curtains and stuff like that. But if there's a building that is complete, this is just a box. There's nothing inside here, right? They always make sure the shutters are completely drawn. There's no light coming from behind curtains or anything like that, right? There's no hint of anything. So it takes a very stringent outlook and a very close relationship with your art department, so people don't get annoyed with you. And the 12th time you're like, nope, sorry, that board looks breakable. You need to make them more sturdy. And yeah, it just requires that diligence and a relationship with the art team.
Cool, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, audience questions. In the chat here, we have a question from Sarah Farr, who says, how do you balance your own ideas with those of the group?
Carefully. This is where it really helps to work at a studio where you're kind of passionate. I guess I'm going to speak really quick about, I forgot to mention this in my talk, but passion is bandied about a lot, and it's weaponized by developers, I think, to make people work overtime. But I think it's very important to have. But yeah, so by working at a place that you love or like their games, then you're already probably going to be more in line with their way of thinking anyway. So that helps. But also, I think just like, playing those games and getting to know them really well, that will shape your ideas into that space. Where I work, we have a very open sort of bottom-up culture of idea sharing. So level designers can say, hey, I've got this idea for what if this level is a dinner party and the player had to sneak around in the dinner party but in plain sight. And then that gets talked about and it makes it into the game. So I think it's It's a matter of working somewhere where they are likely to be accepting of those sort of things, as well as knowing that sometimes your ideas will get in and sometimes they won't, and just being able to sort of make peace with that. And yeah, and hopefully, yeah, you're working at a smaller studio also helps. A lot of ideas can be contributed if you're in a smaller studio than if you are somewhere like Ubisoft, for instance, where there are like 3 directors above you and all that stuff. So.
Oh, and
Okay, I got a question on Discord regarding like the Dishonored series and Prey, and oftentimes there's like 20 or 30 different ways that you can beat a level or get to the next step. So the question was, how many of those play styles or playthroughs are kind of decided at the beginning of the level? Like, do you think about like every single way that they could kind of finish the level, or do you just kind of leave it open and the players kind of figure out how they want to do it their own way?
It's a combination of the two. I think there's like, the first half a dozen or so that the designer thinks about, and then the other 50 come from QA or from people actually playing the game after it's out. The important thing there is, again, making sure like the what, not how. So it's like, okay, the player needs to find and take this hard drive, pick it up. That's all I have to do is grab the hard drive off of this table we've set it on. We don't care how they get into the room, right? Like you could say, okay, well, we're going to put a trigger volume on the door, and when they enter the door, then this specific thing happens, and now they can grab the hard drive and stuff like that. But it's like, no, all we care is interactive with hard drive, and that's it. So how they got into the room, we don't care. And then you can plan for, then you take a step back and you're like, okay, well, the player has the ability to turn into a rat or become a cloud of smoke or hack a computer, and then you try to build around that with the interesting sort of lattice of player abilities. And so that makes things come together. Sometimes, like in Dishonored, I had that whole poisoning scene where this guy drinks poison, but the player can also possess people. And so I had this it might have been a couple of weeks I spent making sure that if the player possessed the guy after he drank the poison, that the player would die because the player was poisoned. But then later I realized there was no way you could actually pull that off because you don't have as many runes as you need to buy that power at that level in that scene. So it was a little over prepared.
Okay, cool. And then going off that, have you ever designed a level where, like, as you said, you want to keep things open and focus on the what, not how, but it was just so ridiculous and so game breaking that you just had to take it out?
Let me think about that for a moment. I don't think so. I mean, there have been bugs and things like that, but for the most part, we embrace the sort of variability of things, and I can't think of anything offhand that came across as too game breaking for us to allow. I can't think offhand of something. I guess there was the ability in Dishonored, you can bend time and freeze things. So there was a point where you could like toss something in the air and freeze it, and then you could go mantle on that object that you froze in the air and then jump off of it. I think we ended up cutting that out, but
Okay, I think Grant has a question.
I really liked how you commented on the concept of saying yes to the player, and I guess I'm kind of wondering where you sort of draw the line and have to say no, if there's kind of, or how you would measure that, if there's kind of a way you go about thinking that, because of course we all want to say yes to everything, but you obviously are going to have to say no to some things.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It kind of depends on, it's a matter of, I guess, the focus filter of the pillars of your project. The hot dog cart example that Clint Hawking gave a long time ago is kind of the cornerstone of the extreme. It's like, okay, the player comes across a hot dog cart in this first person shooter, and it's like, well, they can't stop and make hot dogs here, right? So you have to kind of look at the power fantasy or the focus of your game and say, well, okay, the player would not be interested in doing this, or we want to keep them on track. And so this is something that would be beyond the pale. And then another thing is you try to cut off anything that is approaching that margin that could invite the player towards imagining what they could do with something. And that's talking with the art team again of like, okay, well, we can't have, I'm trying to think of a nice concrete example, but it's like, we can't have this object because it looks like the player might want to interact with it. But we don't support that, so we need to cut the object instead of just leaving it in and disappointing the player. Because eventually you get this learned helplessness thing where they're like, okay, well, the newer Deus Ex games, they had this one room that bugged me because there was a coffee maker and a tea maker sitting right next to each other, and you could interact with the coffee maker but not the tea maker. And I'm like, you could just cut the tea maker. And so yeah, I think it's finding that boundary that maps to your game's sort of core ethos, and then trying to just cull out stuff that does not work. And that, again, that's a conversation with the art team of like, okay, we can't have clocks because we have a real-time clock system. We can't support it, so remove them, that sort of thing.
Let's take another audience question. We have a question from Canvas Madness who says, I have an opportunity to work as a concept character designer for Riot Games, but it requires me to move to Los Angeles. I'm only 18. Did you ever have to pack up and leave to follow your career? Were there any specific challenges that came with that if you did?
Yes. Actually, I had a friend who's even more extreme than I was, though. I think he went to LA to work somewhere, but the first no, wait, this might have been someone I heard. Anyway, he lived on the beach for like a week or two while he was like trying to find an apartment in LA and stuff. It sounded pretty extreme. But yeah, my history there, I started in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And so my first job was in Chicago. And so that was a huge like culture shock, big move and all that stuff. And I didn't, I was not as financially stable at that point because I just gone through grad school and stuff like that. So it was a huge step, but it ended up with me in a better place in the long run. It was just a struggle getting there. And so, that was definitely a big move.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that for your first game design job or level design job, they had you do a test during your interview. Do you remember what that was? And is that still a common practice?
It's still a pretty common practice. It was use an example of the rock, paper, scissors mechanic in a game, I guess. And so I came up with I took it literally, I guess, and had an actual rock, paper, scissors mini game incorporated into a fantasy RPG like Skyrim or something. And so I made a whole design doc that circled around that. But yeah, we do a lot of when we do level design tests, I do a paper map test as well as a written test that just sort of digs into the sort of thought process of, you come across this situation, what do you do in this situation? Or suppose you had to implement this kind of idea, how would you do it? And that sort of thing.
And now that you're in somewhat of a managerial position where you're kind of also helping out with the hiring process, you mentioned that you evaluate levels. People send in their portfolio and they have levels they design. What specifically do you kind of look for, that separates a good level from a bad level when evaluating potential employees?
Sure. So one thing is polish, whether or not stuff is sloppy or, whether it's like orderly and put together well. And the sort of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, does it run? Is it polished? And then, is it entertaining, or does it subvert my expectations or do something interesting with the formula, depending on the kind of game it's in? Like, does it put a twist on things, basically? Or have I played this mission 1,000 times before, right? It's not just enough to be able to script something to exist. That's sort of like the minimum bar. And then it has to go above and beyond to be something memorable. Like, oh yeah, that was my favorite level in a game. If a level approaches that, then that would be something that stands out to me, I guess. And you can sort of feel I don't want to say passion again, but the sort of enthusiasm that enters into the creation process.
Okay, right. And just going back to we got a question from Sarah regarding that rock, paper, scissor test in your interview. How long did you have to do that? Was it like take this at home, figure this out? And how does it work, in the current day? Like, do you have to figure out on the spot when you're interviewing people, or is it something that you have to come up with over a set period of time?
Well, we had to send things by Pony Express back in my day, so it was a matter of 6 months. No, I had about a week, I think, to do it, something like that, and that's roughly what we do here. It's usually about a week or so, something like that. It's kind of open, but it depends on how many people we have applying for a job as well. If it's like super slow, it's like you can take your time because no one else is putting in anything right now. But I'd say about a week, and it depends on the content creation role. Like some people doing environment art or architecture stuff might get like 2 weeks or so to put something together, depending.
Okay, so it seems like you have your hands full being, lead level designer at Arkane Studios. Why did you decide? What kind of made you decide that you wanted to teach at ACC in your spare time with all the other responsibilities that you have going on?
It's a really cool opportunity to sort of see where level designers are coming from these days. I think I think like there's a lot of disconnect between when I was getting in and now, because there aren't as many mapping and modding opportunities in games these days for some reason. So it's really cool to be able to see and influence, come back to the entry level space, I guess, and see how people are building levels and help encourage that sort of thing in a realm where there are no Half-Life mappers and things like that, right? So yeah, it's a cool opportunity.
Marcy, did you have any questions or?
I'm mostly just focusing on checking on the audience questions right now. I could go for another one here. Sarah Farr also asks, how much influence does a level designer have over user interface or GUI?
Not much. Not much really. It depends on the studio you're at. Again, we're small enough that like if I say, hey, it's really hard to tell how much health the player has left because of the way this meter works or something like that, then that will be heard and can start a conversation. But in general, unless it depends on which aspect of the UI. If it's like, okay, quest markers, for instance, like we define quest markers in areas that the player searches. So we need UI to support search this house. And so we need an area around the house. And so we can talk to the UI people about that and get that sort of stuff implemented.
Cool. And Grant, you had another question?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious how, I guess, real world places, and I know you said it's not architecture, but I'm curious kind of how, if architecture does influence, and just kind of how you go about researching that and incorporating those kind of real life influences into your designs.
Yeah, so I think the reference period is very important. For the most part, that's handled by our architects at Arkane. They're the ones that research that sort of stuff. And so as a level designer, you come up with the sort of idea of the space that's needed. Okay, this needs to take place in a school because of whatever. This needs to take place in a space jail or whatever. But then looking to real world architecture and references, so you can say, okay, well, this is an actual layout of a jail. When I worked in Bioshock 2, for instance, my level was the prison asylum level at the end of the game. And so I went to the Kirkbride, asylum layout sort of source and said, okay, well, to make it feel asylum-like, having these wings and this kind of separation. And that also gives me a really cool hub and spoke structure that I can then use with the quest structure and say, okay, well, now it's do these three things in any order because I've got a hub and spoke. So the quest and the architecture match up. And that came from doing real world research and getting all that stuff together.
Oh, I actually do have another question sort of related to this. What kind of thought process goes into determining the scale of your environment, both from an overall size perspective as well as on a smaller perspective, like, finding the balance between how abstract you want to get with, for instance, the size of a door or the, in terms, especially if you're working with a more realistic environment, how do you kind of abstract that out into something that doesn't feel too big or too small when the player is actually going through it, even if it might be technically accurate to how it would be designed in real life?
There's a lot of iteration and back and forth on that, especially with the real life stuff, like you're saying. A lot of the times it's just like model it, put it in. Does it feel weird? Does it feel, does it feel good? Certain games like third person versus first person, you have a huge disparity there. And sometimes, in I'm trying to remember which one. Like third person, it'll look fine at a distance, but then when you walk up to it, it's like humongous. Some things players feel more than they see. Like like the size of this door feels good, but if you look at it, it's humongous. We did a VR game at one point, the Prey VR thing, and taking all the Prey assets into VR, that opened up this entire can of worms of like, oh my god, like this room is 30 feet tall and this range is tiny, and so just scaling things as you go is honestly the way to go. That and adhering to your metrics. So like, okay, we've got monsters that are 7 feet tall, so doors are going to have to be pretty big. And so then how do you make everything else sort of support that? It's tricky.
Yeah, I've noticed, playing a lot of PSVR games, especially, a lot of objects seem to be way too small. Like Resident Evil 7, actually, the entire world seemed a little bit too small, and it was interesting to see that they, I wonder if that was related to the fact that they built this environment primarily for, not VR.
That would make a lot of sense, especially if I don't know if they send it to a port house or something like that, but if they send it to a third-party port company that's like, okay, no, we're just going to take this directly into VR instead of having the art director be like, no, wait, let's make that, let's scale it up. That would make sense.
And so we're a little over time here, but I guess actually a friend of mine's in here with what kind of looks like a question. I'm not sure. They say, I'd feel like a learn by doing aspect isn't so bad. Players are going to have to explore no matter what, right? Not exactly sure if that was commenting on something, but I don't know if you want to talk anything about that.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I think that this is probably related to the whole consistency thing. And I think so you can take the consistency thing, or you can take certain aspects way too far and sort of it's like a hill to die on, right? There are a lot of cases where the player like smacks something and like, oh, this didn't break, I guess these things don't break, right? So I think that works really well when you're defying real world expectations. So like, oh yeah, I went up to this payphone and I tried to interact with it, but I can't. I guess payphones just aren't interactive in this game. I think that's fine, but then if you do like 3 levels later, there's a payphone that you have to interact with to move forward in the quest, then that breaks consistency inside the game itself. And I think that's bad, because then the player doesn't know what to expect and they don't learn. But if you're breaking consistency with the real world, I think that is mostly okay, as long as you're doing it consistently. So you're saying, okay, well, the player can't use computers in this game, so they're going to see a computer on a desk, but all they have are guns for hands, so they're going to be fine with not being able to type an email or something. So I think that as long as you're consistent with it.
Cool. All right. Do you have any closing remarks?
We just got a question on YouTube, and then after we're done with that, maybe a couple frivolous questions just to wrap this up.
Sure.
Because I know we're running over. So
Sure.
Sarah asked, I heard a talk with a Naughty Dog environment artist say that their responsibility is to keep the player from getting lost. How do you work with the artist to help keep the player spatially oriented?
That's a good question. So one thing, we're a lot less, I want to say on rails, we're a lot less linear than Naughty Dog stuff. So they like I've seen a lot of their talks, and they're very laser focused on like the player rounds this corner and the trees form this sight line and there's a yellow sun. Like they're very diligent about that. We're a lot sloppier, but we rely on a lot of like architectural tropes and things like that, like actual real world landmarking kind of architecture stuff. Making sure there's ample signage in places. Lighting is like, this doorway is going to be well lit, so the player knows that there's a doorway over there. Or we're sending light from above, so they know to look up and climb up this thing. A lot of lighting cues, a lot of color cues, landmarks, so people don't get lost. Avoiding this. I'm going through an entire lecture from my level design class, but avoiding symmetry wherever possible, so you don't come out of a doorway, turn like 45 degrees, and then you're lost all of a sudden. So a lot of things like that.
Okay, cool. And if there's no other serious questions, just I'd like to throw one out there. What's a game that you played recently in the last couple of years that you absolutely love, and share your perspective on why you love it. A non-Arkane game, preferably.
Let's see. The Shadow of the Colossus remake was the past couple of years, so maybe that counts. That's one of my go-to all-time favorite like comfort food kind of games. And
That doesn't count. That was a remake.
Design and world and stuff are just, I don't know. You have this really strong sense of place, and it's so vast and lonely that you just kind of sink into it, and yeah, I don't know. It's a really well-made game, and the monsters are the levels, and that sort of thing is really well done. That's probably one of my faves. That and the new Rogue Legacy is really good. I don't know. I like a lot of. I played a lot of roguelikes when we were doing Moon Crash, and so like Rogue Legacy and things like that are really solid games.
I have a small, very specific question.
Okay.
Has anywhere specifically in Austin that we might know inspired you, like a building or outdoor place? I'm just curious. As an Austinite.
I'm trying to think. I haven't really. I know there's bound to have been something that sort of seeped in there because different things downtown or like some of the hill country areas or stuff like that, just the nature of exploration in the hill country and things like that. But I don't have anything offhand that I can point to. Yeah.
Okay, Steve on YouTube, he's asking, is there any reading materials that you would recommend to get a better idea or for level design?
Yes. I'm trying to think if there's somewhere I could just link a list. I have a list I use for my level design class. Short list. The Design of Everyday Things is a book by this guy named Donald Norman. It's about teapots and doorknobs and stuff, but it's also very much about game design and level design specifically, just indirectly. So definitely that. There are a handful of like architecture and level design and those kinds of books that are pretty good. There's if you're into like fictional books, there's a book called House of Leaves. It's a horror book that's basically architectural horror and level design. This book that just came out called Piranesi, which is very much a spatially oriented level designy kind of thought space. There are a few. I'll see if I can somehow give you a link to like a list of things.
I can email it out and post it in the YouTube description. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's a ton of stuff that I think would be really good, either directly applicable or inspiring those kinds of ideas.
Awesome. Well, I think it's probably a good time to wrap up.
Yeah, Rich, Marcy, you have any other questions or?
Nothing off the top of my head at the moment, but
Rich, I got a lot. You gave out some really good advice, and I think those that will watch this or have watched this, we're getting. I certainly got a lot out of it, and I just appreciate you so much for taking the time to do this. I mean, I was blown away. I didn't know you'd have a whole like PowerPoint presentation, like ready. Like that blew me away. So just thank you so much for the effort, and I know you're doing this like just to help us out and help us achieve our goals of working in the industry. So I thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Great talk.
Yeah, thank you so much.
A lot.
Yeah.
And
All right.
Well,
I will see you in level design next semester.